Welcome to Farm Your Daily, a field forward podcast. I'm your host, David Geiger. Today on Farm Your Daily, harvest is nearly over this year. We take a look at how it's gone, what farmer questions were had, and the state of crop residue this year with ISU Extension agronomist Meaghan Anderson. Please be sure to like and follow the podcast as well as our social media at Field Forward Pod. We would love to have you join our community, keeping folks informed about what is affecting our farmers. This is Farm Your Daily. And joining us on Farm Your Daily, we're going to take a look at what is going on across the state of Iowa in terms of harvest progress. And to do so, we have with us Central Iowa agronomist Meaghan Anderson with ISU Extension. Meaghan, always good to have you back on the program. It's been a while. And let's get some harvest updates. Central Iowa, I assume soybeans are done. But what have you seen over the past week or so here in harvest?
Yeah, most people really were able to finish up soybeans not too far into October with the good weather that we had. And we've had a couple little spells of some rain since then, but really hasn't done too much to impede corn harvest progress either. And I would say that we're not done with corn harvest, but we are pretty darn close overall to being done with corn harvest. There's not too much left on the landscape here in central Iowa.
And just because we haven't had these government reports, I feel folks have been relying on, boots on the ground conversations about this. So take me through harvest so far this year. What have you seen in terms of progress? It's been, as far as I've seen, pretty dry. So I imagine it was moving at a pretty good pace.
Yeah, in fact, some people that I've talked to have said that it was their fastest harvest ever, which is really impressive because last fall was far drier, right? And we had, I wouldn't say necessarily better conditions, right? But just as good conditions early and then less rainfall in the later part where we got kind of in the mid part of October or so. And so it really has been a quite impressive fall that everybody's been able to get out and get a lot of work done, even with a little bit of moisture here and there. And honestly, that little bit of moisture's, I think, really been good for us because it's not good to go into fall as dry as we were last year. So I think the rainfall that we had this year, it was to the detriment of the crop in some parts. We're definitely, I think, feeling it from a corn yield standpoint with the moisture that especially allowed that southern rust to really go nuts here in central Iowa. But having that moisture here has done wonders for helping kind of jumpstart the process of breaking down our crop residue, which has been a major issue the past couple of years. And alleviating some problems with like soil sampling, right? Last fall, it was virtually impossible to do soil sampling because it was so incredibly dry. And then if you got test results back, they were kind of out of whack. And having good moisture in the soil is going to be helpful when we get started here on anhydrous. I know a few people have gotten started, but hopefully we can be more reliably at that kind of 50-degree and below and dropping temperatures here as we get into the early part of November and can get some of that work done before winter really strikes. But overall, I think things have gone really relatively smoothly this fall with only a few hiccups.
I definitely want to touch on the soil residue aspect here in a moment, but I do want to ask a question about, you mentioned how last year it was potentially even drier, but it might have been a little bit slower. What would vary in a field from year to year that dryness would affect how folks are harvesting?
That's a great question, right? I think last year we had incredibly high yields, and that was probably one of the big things in corn that slowed us down, where I've talked to some people this year that not only has their harvest been faster because the corn yields have been slightly lower, but they've used less fuel and a number of other things that are just going to make their speed in moving through the fields a little bit quicker maybe than they were last fall, which is not a good thing, right? We don't want to see lower yields, but it was definitely a side effect of the rest of the conditions that happened during summer.
That brings me back to a question that I was asking a couple agronomists from ISU Extension before harvest, and that was, we had some later season rains that were helping prop up some of those soybeans a bit, but that always caused the concern of overly thick or too green soybeans when harvest rolls along. Were there issues with folks going through the bean fields and them being overly thick, or just having a struggle getting through all of the beans this year? Because I've heard beans are doing a little bit better in terms of bushels than corn.
I think what you're trying to ask me is, did I hear complaints about this, the infamous green stem syndrome that has about a
Yes.
laundry list of like 50 causes. Yes, I did hear some of those complaints. I think probably other parts of the state had better yields than some of the farmers that I work with, though we did have, relatively speaking, much better soybean yields overall than we did corn yields, I think, for a lot of farmers. Toward the end of the season, the corn yields were definitely better. Some of the longer season corn, some of the later planted corn just seemed to do a little bit better, suffer a little less from the moisture and the southern rust. But yeah, the beans were, especially where they were yielding better. It seemed like we had some greener stems. Um, it happens in low yielding soybeans too, and there's a number of different reasons that those kinds of issues can occur. But we always seem to have the issues with that it's a little slow going in beans, right? Can't get started quite as early as you'd like in the day, can't go quite as late at night. Those bean stems get really tough. And the green stem thing does persist for yet another year.
This brings back to a question that we had a bit before harvest began, and that was the strength of the stalks. And so many farmers were focusing in on fields that had questionable stalk strength and stability. Did we really get a good job this year of finding those fields, taking care of them, or did we have some cornfields tipping over?
That's a really great question, and I do think we did a good job of really jumping on some of these fields earlier than maybe we would have if we weren't aware of all the issues that existed out in fields. And I'm really glad to have seen that. That's not to say that in October I still wasn't getting phone calls about issues that were persisting in crop fields, because I think just overall the crop, it used every resource that it had this year, and it didn't have great big root systems in a lot of these fields, especially on our heavier soils here in central Iowa, because they just were never forced to kind of put down roots very deep. They always had plenty of water available to them. And so I think we were able to get a lot of that corn out of the field early. I think that we did suffer some from various types of loss. I think that's been quite obvious this fall with the intense level of volunteer corn that's been out in fields after harvest, and with the early harvest start and the fact that we got some rainfall this fall, that's been really visible. And hopefully it just means that we don't have to deal with as much of it next spring as we would have otherwise if we would have stayed dry. But yeah, the stalk integrity has been an issue. And then as we got later in the fall, I heard more from farmers that as they were combining through fields, especially in wetter areas, they were straight up just pulling corn plants out of the ground with the headers. And so it has been kind of a wild harvest that I'm glad is reaching its end. But there have been no shortage of sort of plant integrity, plant breakdown, residue distribution, loss of corn out of the back of the combine or wherever it's coming from. There's been all kinds of strange issues like that as a result of the weather we've had.
Let's talk about some of the other issues that you may have been involved with as folks were calling in, just in terms of health of the ear and the pods as they came out. Were there any interesting takes or questions you had or received from folks as they looked at the results of some of the disease pressure we had this year and other issues?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a year where we definitely saw the benefit of a fungicide in our corn specifically. Maybe didn't necessarily see it so much in our soybeans. It was really incredible how we had this major blow up of disease pressure in corn. And honestly, there was a little bit of just about everything in soybean, but probably the biggest thing we had was kind of scattered patches of SDS in beans. But the benefit of a timely application of fungicide in a lot of corn this year was quite obvious, and in some cases the detriment of either skipping the fungicide or not being able to get it on in a timely manner because of the way the weather was. There were a lot of issues with that, and I cannot emphasize enough how unusual a year this was, right? And that we do not expect to see this again anytime soon. You will find me putting my foot in my mouth next fall if we're having the same conversation where we've had an incredibly rainy and hot summer. But southern rust is just a really kind of a rare beast that we don't run into very often here in central Iowa. So it's definitely been a good learning year. I'm a little bit cautious about trying to learn too much from such a weird year, but it's been a good learning year nevertheless.
That is a good follow-up then. Are You mentioned you don't expect to see southern rust again. Is that because this isn't like something like sudden death where it would be in the soil and therefore it would have a higher chance of reinfecting a field that it was in before? Or is it just because it is primarily based in the south and it requires very specific conditions to migrate as far north as it did?
So, David, I was very careful not to say that did not expect that we would see southern rust again.
I
I
inferred too
absolutely
much.
expect we'll
I
see it.
inferred
Yes,
too
you
much. I
inferred too
apologize.
much. But I do not expect to see it at the level we saw it this year again next year, or hopefully not anytime in the near future, unless we have a very strange weather combination like we had this year. And so that is, as you alluded to, because it doesn't overwinter here in Iowa. It doesn't have anything to survive on. It cannot survive the winter in Iowa in our soil like so many of our other diseases do, right? SDS survives the winter, frog eye leaf spot, tar spot survives the winter, gray leaf spot, northern cordon leaf blight, all of these other foliar diseases that we see year in, year out. Those survive the winter. They are hanging out in the soil, hanging out on residue right now. Southern rust requires living corn to survive on. And so it basically can't survive anywhere in the US because there is not living corn. And so every summer it has to blow up to Iowa. We typically see it just about every summer. Often we don't see it until late July or August. It just depends on what the weather has been like. And then it really requires specific weather conditions to spread. And we had the ultimate kind of trifecta of susceptible corn and weather conditions and that disease making it up to Iowa this year.
This is Farm Here Daily. We will continue the conversation in just a moment, but first let's take a look at the market close heading into the weekend. And there was some greening grains at the market close. December corn a penny and a quarter higher, 431.5, with March up a quarter cent at 444. Soybeans in November 8.5 cents higher at 10.99 and 3/4, with January beans 7.5 cents up at 11.15 and a quarter. Soybean meal in December $6 a ton higher at $321.60. Soybean oil in December a penny lower, 48.68 a pound. Wheat in December, 9 3/4 cents up at 5.34, with March rising 8 cents at 5.48.5. Hard red winter wheat in December, 11.5 cents stronger at 5.24.5, with March rising 7 3/4, 5.36 3/4. In the livestock market close for Friday, there was some red in cattle. Looking in December, live cattle seeing a $1.42 loss, $229.67, with February falling $1.82 at $227.67. Feeder cattle in November, $2.95 down at $338.87, with January falling $2.32 at $331.90 a hundredweight. December lean hogs 45 cents up at $81.27, with February rising 42 cents at $82.52. That is the Friday market close. This is Farm Here Daily. Meaghan, I want to return back to what you were speaking of earlier of soil residue, crop residue on fields. And that has been a pretty big problem in recent years. I recall even some conversations a while back of folks needing to have a plan to remove some residue because it just wasn't breaking down quick enough and it was impeding the next year's planting times. What about this year? We're seeing the moisture during the fall to help start that decomposition process. What about this year, and what about that residue has really stuck out to you that you've been learning about over the past couple of years?
Yeah, I think we have definitely seen the benefit the last couple of years of having like really timely, those sort of like just in time rainfalls to keep the crop going. But unfortunately, what that's meant is that it doesn't seem like it leaves a lot of fuel there for that soil microbiology and the chemical reactions to happen to break down residue as much as we would like. And especially with, I think last winter, maybe we were kind of short on snowfall, right? We weren't particularly cold. We did get really cold, but we didn't have a lot of snow cover, and so we've just been kind of running on this like just barely enough moisture, just barely enough moisture, and I think that's shown in that we just haven't had that residue breakdown. We've had issues with spreading extremely dry residue as well, right? When it's super dry and it breaks up into super fine pieces, it ends up in like windrows across the field, and it's easy for it to blow around. And so, especially in our no-till fields, but even in tilled fields, we've seen some issues with the uneven residue distribution. And so, I think this year has really kind of unfortunately, right? Because the southern rust really got started on that corn, and the heavy presence of the moisture helped decay roots probably faster than it did in past years. And so that has meant that that corn's really started that breakdown process quite a bit earlier. It's hopefully been easier to spread the residue. I don't know that it necessarily has been, but I know that our digital ag group put out some resources this fall talking about the importance of that residue distribution, because really that is like the first step, right? This year's crop harvest is the first step in preparation for planting next year, especially if you don't have tillage to try and kind of clean things up. And tillage can do some work to clean it up, but it can't totally solve the problem if we've got a big residue distribution issue in a field. Um, but I'm hoping that by next spring we won't see as much residue as we did the past couple springs because of the amount of moisture we had.
Maybe this isn't your area of expertise in particular, but I think it'd be a good conversation to touch on at some point on the programming, and that is there have been a change in how folks coming out of state universities, ISU, agriculture focused locations have been from reducing the loss of organic matter to being able to build organic matter within soils and fields and within the system of agriculture. And a part of that conversation has been shifting a little bit when it comes to when we started introducing things like stover harvest for livestock feed or for biofuels. Do we have a better understanding now on how much stover we can remove from fields before we are going back to a situation of reducing organic matter as opposed to building organic matter?
I think we do. I personally would have to do a little bit of research on it, but I know Iowa State's got some really good resources, especially because Central Iowa has been kind of the hotbed for that prospect of stover removal. And so they do have some general best management practices if somebody's considering that for being able to maintain that soil or the crop residue in a way that's not going to be the detriment long term to your soil. I know the one of the big things with that stover removal is that you are taking a substantial number of nutrients away with that stover, right? It's kind of counterintuitive, right? You don't
Right. Yeah.
necessarily
It's
think about it
it's
having that
feeding
many
itself. Yeah.
nutrients. Yeah, and so you do need to keep that in mind, right? When you do that stover removal, that there's likely nutrient that needs to be replaced. Then, and that's a value to you that you need to make sure that you're taking account for in whatever the cost of that removal is. But we definitely have some people that can visit with you about that, David.
Speaking of visiting with folks over there at ISU Extension, there are a couple things going on this November. Can you describe some interesting events or places folks can go to learn more about what's going on at ISU?
Yeah, so fall is always a big time for kind of sneaking in those last few field day opportunities. And so Iowa Learning Farms is a conservation group at Iowa State that they always put on some really nice uh, various topics related to conservation field days. And so usually you can find something on cover crops or maybe on some edge of field type water quality practices. And I know that there's at least one of them happening here over the next few weeks. And so iowalearningfarms.org is a great place to go look at their event schedule and see that. And then right in central Iowa, in my neck of the woods, there's going to be a soil compaction school on November 14th. And so Kapil Arora and Mahari Takesti are pairing up to bring some really cool in-field demonstrations and some classroom discussion about managing compaction and reducing its impact on our crops. It certainly could have a 10 to 20% yield loss effect on crops, depending on the severity of compaction and the type of growing season that we have. And it's really important to think about, especially as our equipment continues to get bigger, how we can manage that. And so if you just search for the Soil Compaction School online or go to extension.iastate.edu and search for it, you can find information about that as well.
I think I've heard of that before, and it's really cool because they'll like have a spot of compaction and then they'll dig down and show you how far down that compaction really works and what it does.
Yeah, and I think they'll probably do they did a meeting, I can't remember, that must have been last year, and they got rained out so they weren't able to do it. So hoping
Right.
for good weather, but I'm hoping they'll do what's called a lasagna pit where they basically layer sand and soil and then drive over it so that you can actually see basically every place that those move, you can see how deep that compaction goes in that lasagna pit.
That sounds fantastic. Again, ISU Extension, you can look at the Soil Compaction School. Is that what it's
Yep.
called?
Yep.
Soil Compaction School. Excellent. Meaghan Anderson is an ISU Extension agronomist for Central Iowa, joining us here. Thank you so much, Meaghan, for your time on Farm Your Daily.
Thanks for having me.
This is Farm Your Daily, a Field Forward podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Again, in order to continue to produce this type of local content, we would love to have you join our community. So please follow the podcast as well as our social media channels at Field Forward Pod. You can also find me on social media at Geiger Reports. Again, I am your host, David Geiger, and I'll be back again on Monday. Have a good weekend, everybody.